So we got a question coming in from Roberto. So what are your thoughts about Borland, Browning, and Werner? They've been in two horrible defenses. 2018, he's considering 2020 to be the same. People blame scheme problems, but they still disappointed both years. Thoughts? Who wants to take that one?
You're not in a horrible defense if you're in a national championship game. So right there, I disagree with the premise. Borland, Browning, and Werner were all fine in my opinion. Pete Werner is so underrated, it's ridiculous. Baron Browning finally found a home this year on the outside. He was miscast as a middle linebacker, and he will tell you that. Tough Borland is what he is. He's the leader of the defense, calls all the plays, gets everybody lined up, and shouldn't be defending slot receivers. That's 99.9% of middle linebackers in America. And that's not Tough Borland's fault. That's the safety's fault. That's Kerry Combs' fault. That's everybody else's fault for putting him in that situation. That's Steve Sarkisian's fault. That's not his fault. No linebacker, no safety, very few corners can defend Devontae Smith. I'm not going to get upset with Tough Borland because he's one of these guys that can't do what Sean Wade and Seven Banks have trouble doing. That's, so I think the linebackers are very good. We'll see how things go next year because you're going to have three new ones. And you lose Justin Hilliard as well. You lose four seniors, and now you're going to be replacing them with also some rising seniors who have played here and there but are not completely, they're relatively unproven. And I know people get, the familiarity breeds contempt, and they stopped giving Tough Borland a shot after that 2018 defense, which was bad in terms of relative to what Ohio State does in a bad scheme. And you saw what a good scheme looked like last year. And then this year, again, it's hard for me to go all judgmental this season because it was a pandemic season, and Ohio State had some secondary issues that caused problems all over the place. And secondary meaning in the defensive backfield. And linebackers were a strength of this team, and that's where I stand on it.
I'll be quick because I'm sure I cut Steve off before, but the problem wasn't necessarily with the linebackers this year. I think that the linebackers were probably the most consistent unit. I mean, I think that the secondary certainly had some issues. I think that the defensive line had issues with who it was missing. But Mac Jones was getting rid of the ball so fast. I don't know how much of a pass rush you were going to get there, but I'm not going to sit there and say that this defense was below standards just because certain players were on the field in both of those seasons. I think that the linebackers probably were more of a liability in 18 than they certainly were here in 20. So I see that as an unfair blanket statement there. I don't put it on the linebackers. I mean, there's certainly, people want to sit there and see Raekwon McMillan and some guys like that out there. They didn't have Raekwon McMillan. So it, kind of is what it is. And, I think we're all going to be seeing how, history is going to look back at what these 2020 guys really were when we get to 2021, when guys like Mitchell, Pope, Gant are going to be really in the mix. And I think they all really can be successful, but, we're not going to know until we know.
My feeling is that this Borland, Werner, Hilliard, Browning group was a good enough group. Ohio State was great against the run, and those guys were part and parcel of that. But I think you can have two of those guys. The third guy needs to be, as Jordan Bowman commented here, an Isaiah Simmons. If you have two of those guys in your three-man linebacker core, the third guy has to be an All-American, an Isaiah Simmons. And that's what they didn't have. Somebody who could run sideline to sideline, make plays in the backfield, cover people, basically somebody who's an All-American who can do it all. If you want to win at this level, I mean, you can win the Big Ten with these guys. That's great. There's nobody in the secondary who would have started on the 2014, 15, 16, 17, maybe the 18 team. There's nobody in the secondary, not even Sean Wade, who would have started on any of those teams. So you're trying to win big, win a national championship with guys that aren't as good as, guys that you've had in those positions in the past, not even close. And, part of it's like Kevin said, you lose two guys who get arrested back in February, have Cam Brown go down with an injury, have guys that haven't panned out. I mean, you have one guy on this roster who was a national top 25 prospect who shall remain nameless from Jacksonville, Florida, national top 25 prospect who's barely played a handful of plays 3 years in. I mean, you've had some misses. You've had guys transfer out. You've had any number of different issues. I mean, you have to look in the eye, look the problem dead in the eye, and say there's nobody special in the back seven. And I mean, they're good. The linebackers are good cleanup players. In this game, once again, they all had 8 or 10 tackles. But you know what? None of them changed the game. Browning had a forced fumble that led to a touchdown. That is a potential game-changing play in a game that you win or that you're in position to win. But when you get your ass handed to you the other 58 and a half minutes, nobody in the back seven was special enough to change the tide of that game. That's just the fact of the matter. And had they had Lattimore, Hooker, Denzel Ward back there, maybe the result's a little bit different. Maybe it's a little bit different. Maybe they win 50% of the time and Ohio State wins 50% of the time. In this case, Alabama won 95% of the time. And a lot of it was scheme, but in my mind, very much of this was personnel. And you didn't have national championship caliber personnel at any of the back – not at zero. At zero of the back seven positions did you have national championship caliber personnel. Now, a couple of them could play on a national championship team if you have an Isaiah Simmons or a Denzel Ward or a Marshawn Lattimore or a Hooker there to cover up some deficiencies of the group. But you don't even have one of those caliber players in your back seven, not one. And Shaun Wade being an All-American, we can finally say it, ridiculous. That's just name value. That's people not even watching the games and just picking names out of a hat, because he got torched by Penn State, he got torched by Indiana, he got torched by Clemson, and he got torched here. So, I mean, I don't know. That's my rant. All very nice people. This is not an indictment of Tough Borland or any of these people. Pete Werner, great leaders, great people. They got you to the dance, but they weren't good enough to win this dance. No way, no how. Play that game 10 times. Play that game 100 times. Ohio State might win it 3 or 4 times, and that's if they have a different scheme and they showed no depth. The same 7 guys played in the back the entire game. They didn't bring in Lathan Ransom. They didn't bring in anybody to change things up even a little bit.
And I think you made it very clear that those guys can play on championship teams, but they can't be the centerpiece, and that's what it's all about.
But they can't carry. They can be carried, but they can't carry.
You can go to any championship team in any sport on any level. You know, the Los Angeles Lakers don't need 5 LeBron James, but they need 1, and they need another superstar. You can have role players that do their job, but you can't win it that way.
You have 7 role players in the back seven.
Yeah, Pete Werner is good enough to play on a national championship team, no question.
Shaun Wade would have been the nickelback on some of them other teams.
I was playing the same game in my head, Steve, watching that game. I was going back, and I'll leave it to you guys, and Steve's partially answered this. I was going back as far as like 2012 thinking, when if they had a worse secondary than this one?
Well, 13 was awful with
yeah, they played awful, but
Pittsburgh Brown is one of your starters or whatever. I mean, that's as bad as it gets. 13 was as bad as it gets. They had young guys out there screwing around, and some of them did.
Christian Bryant, those guys weren't better, and Barnett.
Well, Roby by name. I mean, Roby went to the NFL and has had an NFL career, but you know, Christian Bryant certainly hasn't. I don't know. I don't know. Pittsburgh Brown. That's all I have to say. Pittsburgh Brown played in front of Von Bell. That'll just tell you. And when Von Bell got in the game in the Orange Bowl, intercepted a pass on the goal line, and you know, should have played all season and didn't.
I don't necessarily disagree. I'm just thinking about past secondaries. In 2006, they had Antonio Smith as a walk-on, but he ended up being, you know, a Thorpe semifinalist, and he ended up playing well. But yeah,
teams didn't play like they do now back then. Though. I mean, I completely agree. It was like so rudimentary back then.
2018 with trying to figure out, is it Isaiah Pryor, is it Jocelyn Went, and when those are 2 of your 2 choices at safety, that's hard to win with.